What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. One of the questions that I see asked around a lot of forums and different things like that is if Marvel is going to take the X-Men back in the direction of making them the way they used to be. That is to say, a team that struggles with, kind of being looked down upon by normal humanity, but also a team that strives to be heroes and has a very diverse lineup. Is it possible to do that? Is it possible to take them back to the way they were? Or has too much happened? Is it simply just the Pandora's box has been opened and there's no putting the genie back in the bottle? Really, that's a question that can only be answered with the test of time. But I will say X-Men Prime does a pretty darn good job of taking a step in the right direction. For me, growing as a guy who grew up on X-Men, and kind of bear with me here for a second, but as a guy who grew up on X-Men, really the X-Men getting me into Marvel Comics, they always hold a special place in my heart. I mean, for me, it's always the X-Men first and then just whatever else second. Captain America, the Justice League, Superman, Batman, so on and so forth. The X-Men will always be my favorite team in comic books. And so to essentially sit down and to see, the group changing the way it was, Cyclops basically becoming the new Magneto, well, I wouldn't say it was bad. It was such a break from familiarity that it kind of required some getting used to. Now, some folks would never get used to that. Some folks are just don't like that, never gonna read it. And that's fine. I mean, it's just personal preference. It's what people do or don't like. But to see them kind of going back, to see them kind of, going back to their roots, so to speak, works out pretty well. And the cool thing about this is that it's done in a pretty awesome way. Initially, this picks up with Kitty Pryde, and that was one of the things that was kind of missing with the X-Men roster. Remember, Kitty Pryde was a long-standing member of the team. She joined when she was a young girl, and one of the coolest things is that you basically saw her grow as the X-Men title continued on. When Chris Claremont first brought her in, she was taught how to be a woman by Aurora Monroe. She was taught how to be a superhero by the X-Men. And so you could literally follow her growth as a hero and a human being as the X-Men series continued. It's one of the reasons why Kitty Pryde has always been kind of a mainstay popular character for a lot of X-Men fans, is because the X-Men fans grew as she grew. With the Guardians of the Galaxy run, where Kitty Pryde had effectively left the team and was basically kind of out in space, it left a little bit of a hole in the team, almost like where Marvel itself kind of has a hole without the Fantastic Four there. Without Kitty Pryde, the X-Men just weren't really quite the same. Now, I mean, really all we need now to kind of round everything out is Charles Xavier. I can do without Jean Grey. I'd like to see her back, but I wouldn't consider her to be such an essential part of the team that it makes everything perfect. There has to be some measure of freshness there. There has to be some measure of things being a little bit different than the way they were before. Otherwise, all you're doing is just retreading water and just telling the same old stories. But the cool thing is that with Kitty Pryde basically leaving the Guardians of the Galaxy, with Peter Quill going back to his role as leader of the team, this really kind of allowed Marvel to sort of finagle Kitty Pryde and put her back into the X-Men. And the way this happens is by way of Storm. Of course, Storm appearing to Kitty Pryde. Remember, like we said, the two of them had a very close relationship. It was really kind of like a sister relationship, if not like a mother and a daughter in a lot of different ways. And so because this, the two of them are very, very close. And that's why Kitty Pryde is so cool, is because she has such a close-knit relationship with a lot of people there. There was the romance that went on with Colossus, and we'll talk about that here in a little while. There's the fact that she's best friends with Illyana Rasputin, the little sister of Colossus. The fact that Kitty Pryde and Storm are, again, much like mother and daughter in terms of how they relate. The funny thing was that Kitty Pryde was kind of looking for a normal life. I mean, traipsing around the galaxy or really around the universe, facing off against all different kinds of threats. When she had basically left the team, when everything was all said and done and she had walked away, she was looking for some measure of peace, some measure of normalcy. The cool thing about this, though, is that where she was out in space, she wasn't purview to everything that was going on. And of course, Storm does a little bit of catching up here, basically talking about the whole conflict between the Inhumans and the X-Men. We don't need to talk about that. I've got that video down in the description, Inhumans versus X-Men. Not the best, not the highlight of the X-Men's history, but at this point, what it does is it kind of switches over off the coast of Madripoor. Now, in truth, this little bit of the story really kind of seems to come out of nowhere. I mean, I understand where they're going, that they're basically laying the foundation for Weapon X, which is really just kind of like a rebranded X-Force, is really all it seems to be. But we basically pick up with Lady Deathstrike. Now, Lady Deathstrike is effectively smuggling her way, into, I guess, really into Madripoor itself. Again, Madripoor is kind of like the home for criminals. It's a place where really S.H.I.E.L.D. won't even step foot. I mean, it's kind of no man's land. Of course, Lady Deathstrike basically breaks her way out of the shipping vessel just because of the fact that, she didn't pay and that kind of thing. But there's also a few continuity errors that kind of pop up here, most notably from Old Man Logan. The last we saw, Lady Deathstrike had her arms and legs cut off in the Old Man Logan story. Now, the question is, what happened to her? Did she simply heal? Did somebody do some work to restore her? There's really no answer to that question there. And so if you're coming out of Old Man Logan, that's probably one of the first things that popped into your mind. It was for me. And so it's kind of like, how did we get from point A to point B? Or I guess if I were to repeat myself yesterday, how did we get from point A to B to D to C? So the fact remains here that it's really kind of a weird situation, but ultimately we run into a woman named Carla, and Carla is really kind of like this recruit. But again, we don't really know how far reaching this Weapon X concept is. All we really know is that Carla appears to Lady Deathstrike, says, hey, look, I'm offering you a position to become part of our team, basically a clandestine group. Lady Deathstrike turns it down, kills Carla, only to be attacked by a missile and for Carla to have resurrected herself. So again, there's a lot of unanswered questions here. And what Marvel's doing is just kind of laying the groundwork, really inviting us to want to know what happens with the various publications they have coming out after that. But again, it's just kind of setting the seeds in the sense that whatever this Weapon X project is going to be, or whatever this team is going to be, it's going to have Sabretooth, it's going to have Old Man Logan, it's going to have Domino, it's going to have some pretty prominent members of, you know, the darker side of Marvel in terms of these characters being ruthless, these characters being cunning, these characters doing whatever it is they need to do in order to basically pull off their mission. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if it was kind of like a reformed X-Factor meets DC Suicide Squad or something like that. But whatever the case may be, it looks like it'll be pretty intriguing. But at this point, we switch over to X-Haven. Now remember, X-Men Prime is designed to be a jumping off point, but one of the issues here is that there really isn't a lot of explanation. And that's kind of one of the problems that's offered in the story. This could have easily been, you know, a 45-page story as opposed to a standard, you know, 23, 24, or even a 30-page issue. And the reason why is because if this is designed to be a jumping off point, then you basically have to treat those individuals who are picking it up as if they've never read an X-Men comic before. Fans will read it just because of the fact that they want to know what's going on. I'll make videos on it because you guys want to know what's going on. But for the average person, they may not know about my channel, may not know about anything else going on in the X-Men, but when they see something called X-Men Prime #1, they're more inclined to pick it up as opposed to X-Men number 17. Because with number ones, they always sell well because it's a jumping off point. People don't feel like they're jumping into the middle of a series or the middle of a series of events. And so when Kitty Pryde arrives at X-Haven with Aurora, all we're really told here is that the X-Men mansion is in limbo, and it's simply Storm saying, we just needed a place to be safe. Now, to provide the backstory for those of you guys who don't really know what's going on with regards to the X-Men, one of the major things here was that in the events leading up to this story, that is to say, the start of All New, All Different Marvel going into this, the X-Men were basically on the verge of complete and total, you know, extinction because of the Terrigen Mist. But even then, no real explanation was given. And the reason why I say that is because during the events of Infinity, Black Bolt of the Inhumans had basically detonated the Terrigen bomb, which caused the mist to start spreading around the world. But at the time, there was no impact on the X-Men. It didn't impact mutants. It didn't do anything to affect them. All it did was just start waking up Inhumans that were existing around the world of people who didn't know they were Inhumans. And so it was a way for Marvel to kind of bolster the Inhumans ranks. Well, then suddenly All New, All Different Marvel kicks off, and for whatever reason, the Terrigen Mist is killing mutants. Now, the offhanded explanation we got was something about the Terrigen Mist being in the atmosphere for some amount of time or something along those lines, but it was, you know, ad hoc at best. I mean, it was nowhere near a great or even reasonably good explanation. It was just kind of a throwaway one to justify, you know, what was going on with the X-Men at the time. Now, this is one of the things that really comic book fans as a whole hated. And the reason why is because I wouldn't go as far as to say that comic book fans as a whole are like sticklers for continuity. Some are, some aren't. It's really just kind of a mixed bag. But what nobody wants is just kind of some half explanation. They want like a real tried and true explanation of what's going on with a particular event, especially when you're systematically killing off a team as popular as the X-Men. And so because of this, people looked around and they said, well, all we're getting is just kind of this, nonsensical answer. Give us something tangible. Give us something real. Tell us that some mutant lost control of their powers and modified the Terrigen Cloud. Tell us that it's always been that way, but nobody realized what was going on with the X-Men until it was too late. Nobody realized that mutants were dying until it was too late. The impact that the Terrigen Mist has on mutants that leads to their death, no one knew it was happening until 7 or 8 months later. Remember, when the Legacy virus first popped up, it took months for people to realize what the Legacy virus was doing. So again, there was a lot of wiggle room there. There was a lot of way to offer a reasonable explanation, but it seemed like Marvel was just so angry with Fox, they just wanted to kill off the X-Men and call it a day. But of course, the fan backlash, the lack of sales, really kind of forced Marvel to sort of rethink their method on how they dealt with the X-Men team. But again, a little bit of an exposition there, a little bit of an explanation. I kind of thought it was necessary, but because of the fact that everything that was going on with the Terrigen Mist, because of the fact that the Terrigen Mist were killing off the mutants, Storm grabbed what was left of the X-Men who were willing to join their cause and then transfer the X-Men mansion to Limbo, the realm of Ileana Rasputin, of magic. And so it basically allowed the X-Men to operate in a different dimension outside of the influence of the Terrigen Mist. And then all they would really do after that is just run these little recon missions, to the main Marvel universe and just grab mutants and bring them over to the Xavier Institute in order to keep mutants alive. I mean, that was really all that was happening. And so again, Kitty Pryde is coming back to all this. Of course, she re-encounters Colossus. Now, the cool thing thing about this is that this really hits home for a lot of people who read a lot of older X-Men stories, and especially those who read Astonishing X-Men. And the reason why was because in the first story arc, Gifted, Colossus came back to life, and nobody really knew, that Colossus was coming back. He was just there all of a sudden. But the reaction of Kitty Pryde when she basically opens the door and Colossus is standing there is one of the greatest moments in the history of comics, because it's not some great big huge exposition. Oh my God, Colossus, you're alive! I can't believe you're alive! I'm so happy to see you. You don't get that. It's this awesome spread where she's just standing there in utter shock, and she puts her hand on her chest. Colossus runs through her, and that's all she does for that one page. She's just in complete and total shock. And it was one of the coolest moments ever in the history of comic books. I love that moment in Astonishing X-Men. But what X-Men Prime does is it builds on that. It builds on the legacy of Kitty Pryde coming back home, seeing Colossus, Kitty Pryde going through the X-Men mansion, kind of retreading these old steps, regaining familiarity with a place that she called home for so many years. Now, Marvel does not explicitly tell us that like Kitty Pryde and Colossus are going to get back together, but it'd be a great return to familiarity if they did. I mean, Kitty Pryde's just kind of out in no man's land right now. I mean, she's not with, Peter Quill anymore. She's really a single woman. She's on the rebound. It's a chance for Colossus to be like, hey, let's go out to dinner. It'd be a really good return to familiarity. Now, at this point, we transition to again, Kitty Pryde kind of walking through the mansion and coming across Shogo. Now, Shogo Lee is kind of a weird situation. It was Marvel Now's X-Men, and it was written by a guy named Brian. It wasn't Brian Michael Bendis. It was Brian something. I can't remember what his last name was, but it was really this weird story. It was kind of like working with the idea of Sublime as it had been created by Grant Morrison. Not the best story ever told, but essentially what happened is there was a meteor crash. Jubilee went to the location of the crash, and basically adopted a baby that had been orphaned, when the baby's parents were killed. That's really just where Shogo comes from. That's really all we need to know. I mean, there's a little more history there, but nothing of any major significance. But with regards to the character of Jubilee, what it did is it gave her purpose. And the reason why is because Jubilee was kind of a reflection of the fan base in the old X-Men the Animated Series cartoons. And even then, she appeared before the cartoon show in comics, but the cartoon show is really where she got her claim to fame. That's where she was front and center. That's where she was in the limelight. And that's why a lot of people remember her. When they think of Jubilee, they think of X-Men the Animated Series Jubilee. The issue was that her popularity was tied in with the show, much like a lot of characters, like Rogue and Gambit and so on. And so once the show dropped off, the popularity of those characters began to go away. Jubilee was much the same way. Now, following the events of House of M, Marvel tried to rework her character and make her interesting by having her stripped of her powers, but people just still didn't care because, they were like, well, hey, I mean, she could be powerful or she could be useful, but now that she has virtually no powers and then somehow ended up becoming this sort of vampire, well, now she's even more useless than she was before. And so what we saw with Marvel Now was her basically becoming a mom. And it was the next step in her life. It was, well, what's Jubilee going to be like as a mom? I mean, we saw her as a young kid who was carefree, who was fun, having a great time, excited to be part of the X-Men, that kind of thing, as a part of Generation X, her own team. I mean, it was really cool to see, but now people are like, well, what's going to be the next stage of her character? And so what it allows Marvel to do is to basically make Jubilee grow up. It allows Jubilee to be an adult now. So we get to see her as an X-Man and a mom and how she functions in those two roles. And so it's really cool because what this does is it almost kind of feels like the X-Men franchise was put on hold by the mid-90s. That for those of us who were fans of the older X-Men line, that everything between, Grant Morrison's run up until now was just kind of filler or something like that. And it feels like we're picking up where Grant Morrison's run started. We're almost treating Grant Morrison's run like it didn't exist, and we're picking the X-Men up at the end of X-Men Volume 2. I mean, it's just kind of a return to familiarity in a lot of ways. I don't know if I'm explaining that too well, but again, the great thing about X-Men is that they're a generational team. There have been so many different stories, so many different relaunches, and so many different publications that every generation has their own X-Men title. And so for me, as a member of the older generation, this story feels like a return to the X-Men that I've known and loved for so long. And even then, we get that with regards to Kitty Pryde going to the Danger Room. Now, again, the funny thing about this is it's kind of reliving these older memories in the sense that Kitty Pryde wasn't the most responsible human being, when it came to how she dealt with training in the X-Men team. But not only that, her biggest moment came when she had basically swapped bodies with her older self during Days of Future Past, an event that took place in the Danger Room. And so there's a lot of great moments that go back to her character, a lot of great things that Marvel's kind of hearkening to here. Now, ultimately, the reason why she's transitioning to the Danger Room is because of the fact that Marvel seems to be basically shunting all new X-Men out. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, all new X-Men was basically Brian Michael Bendis and Marvel's way of trying to reinvigorate and refresh the X-Men title. And the reason why was because by this point, Cyclops was on the path to becoming Magneto if he wasn't there already. The X-Men titles were much darker than they used to be. The idea of the X-Men basically being a reflection of, prejudice in the world, dealing with people who were minorities and who were outcasts or whatever the case may be, that had long since been gone. People looked at that and said, that's a Chris Claremont era style of storytelling. This is the new era. And so what we ended up seeing was Brian Michael Bendis writing all new X-Men that had the modern day Beast traveling into the past, presumably another dimension or maybe the same dimension, grabbing the all new X-Men or grabbing the younger version of the X-Men and bringing them here. Now, the reason why I say, presumably another dimension is because even within this story, these younger X-Men basically say, we don't know if this future is our future or if it's the future of another universe. All we know is that the X-Men here, these versions of ourselves, are older. And so again, it was basically a way for Beast to kind of bring these younger X-Men into the modern day and show Cyclops how far he'd fallen in terms of being a bad guy. Ultimately, it didn't really work. Cyclops, eventually went on to become even more of a bad guy, killed Charles Xavier, and then eventually died. And so because of that, it was kind of one of these situations where there were those who liked all new X-Men and those who didn't like all new X-Men. But again, Marvel's hearkening back to the way the X-Men used to be and saying, we're shunting the all new X-Men out. We're basically moving them out of the way. Now, they're still going to be around, but they're not going to be part of the main X-Men line of comics. At least it doesn't seem to be that way. Instead, what we end up finding is that when Kitty Pryde gets into this danger room, the entire sequence she's seeing with these younger X-Men facing off against, the various forces of the danger room is actually just kind of a recording. They've long since taken off. They grabbed a Blackbird, they basically booked out of there, and that was really it. And so what this does is it basically picks up with Kitty Pryde speaking to Illyana Rasputin. This is really kind of the last stop on her tour to see whether or not she wants to stay, because remember, at this moment, she's not sure she's actually going to stay behind. But what ends up happening here is in their conversations, Illyana says, look, things just aren't the way they used to be. Things are just a little bit darker. The skies are just a little bit cloudier. People's heads hang a little bit lower and they walk with a few less smiles. Things just aren't as great as they used to be. What we need are things to be the way they were before. We need the X-Men to be this sort of beacon for mutants around the world to travel to. We need to be this lighthouse on the edge of the water in a sea of fog and darkness in order to give people an idea of where they should go. Because historically, that's what the X-Men were. The X-Men were never really a team that was constantly embroiled in fighting other teams. They were really more on a mission of exploration and a mission of instruction. That was the basis behind it. Charles Xavier envisioned the X-Men to be this team that basically said, hey, look, on one side, we're going to try to create a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants. And if that means that we end up getting into conflicts here and there, then be that as it may, we'll do the best we can. On the other side, his idea was we need to show people that mutants are good guys. Those mutants who do bad things, those mutants who are criminals, we need to show the world we don't stand for that. We side against those bad guys, not with them. It's the reason why the X-Men and Magneto's Brotherhood of Evil Mutants always came into conflict. But what Illyana Rasputin says is, we need that. We need that return. We need that familiarity. We need things to be as great as they were before. And so what we end up getting is basically Kitty Pryde calling all these different X-Men back. The all-new X-Men being brought back. We get Storm, basically kind of staying instead of, essentially walking away. We get Quentin Quire. We get a lot of these classic X-Men that we knew and we loved. And what Kitty Pryde says is, we need hope. We need future. We need people to look at us and to not see us as some crazy group of fanatics that's just fighting to stay alive. What we need to be are heroes. And Kitty Pryde says, we can't do that from limbo. We can't do that from some dimension outside of Earth. We can't show up from a portal, fight some guys off, and then disappear, no one knowing where we come from or where we're going. What we need is a place that people can say that's where the X-Men are. What we need is a place that people can travel to. And she even says, we can't do that in Westchester. Another example where Marvel's not retreading old waters. They're bringing us back the X-Men that we know are familiar, but kind of also giving us a new place for the X-Men to call their own, a new legacy. And so what ends up happening is the X-Men mansion is transitioned to Central Park, New York. Now, from here, what this does is this splits off into a series of new stories. This is really almost like Decimation, like the post-Decimation landscape of Marvel, where they broke off and it was new X-Men and it was, these different X-Men titles, so on and so forth. What we end up getting is X-Men Gold, X-Men Blue, Weapon X, Generation X, and then of course we get the solo series, or the ones that are they're coming out the soonest, Jean Grey, Cable, and Iceman. But it's really just kind of a refresher. It's basically a return to familiarity of the X-Men that a lot of us knew and loved. But with that being said, guys, if you are new here to Comics Explain, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.